I'm David Acton, Curator of Photographs at the Snipe Museum of Art at the University of Notre Dame, here to share some observations and ideas about our exhibition, Touchstones of the 20th Century. Today I'd like to talk about the photographer Fritz Kaeser, who was a foundation figure for our photography collection as a collector, a photographer, and in many other ways, even after his death. On the left, you see Fridolin Kaeser, Fritz Kaeser's grandfather and namesake. He was one of a group of Swiss immigrants to the United States in the late 19th century who lived in Illinois and Wisconsin. They were farmers and businessmen, and together they founded the company Helvetia Milk Condensing to produce condensed and evaporated milk and distribute this product in cans. At the end of the century, this company changed its name to PET, evaporated milk, and settlers to the American West carried this product, and in the first years of the 20th century, evaporated milk was distributed to the American troops during World War I, creating enormous wealth for the partners of PET Milk Company. Fritz Kaeser was born in Greenfield, Illinois, near St. Louis in 1910. When he was in high school, his family moved to Madison, Wisconsin, where his father, a lawyer, was chief counsel for the PET Milk Company in the Midwest. His family was very wealthy, so Fritz Kaeser never really had to work for a living. In the late 1920s, he attended the University of Wisconsin to study industrial design and art, and later the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and he became interested in photography. In 1932, Kaeser went to Los Angeles to work as an apprentice to William Mortonsen, a very peculiar photographer who worked in the film industry. He made photographs for silent films and developed his own pictorial style during the 20s and 30s, which was as dramatic as the cinema of the age. Here I'm showing you two images by Mortonsen representing a totally fictitious Tibetan Lama on the left and a rather erotic witch on the right flying her broomstick over a village landscape. On the left is Mortonsen himself, and on the right, a self-portrait of Fritz Kaeser from this period, which uses the same style and technical tricks that Mortonsen used in his own photographs. Late in 1933, Kaeser went back to Madison, where he met Millie Tangen. Here's a photograph of Millie Tangen, who became Mrs. Fritz Kaeser in 1934, and you can see how the style and technique of this photograph of the young woman dressed in a Swiss costume is similar to that of Mortonsen. Millie Tangen was a dancer who danced at the University of Wisconsin and planned on a career in dance performance. In 1938, Fritz and Millie Kaeser went to Colorado, where Millie attended a dance workshop led by Perry Mansfield and Steamboat Springs. There, she met many of the most famous dancers of the period, and Fritz photographed dancers such as Jose Limon on the right and on the left, Hanya Holm. After this summer, Fritz and Millie went to Aspen, Colorado. They fell in love with Aspen, which in the late 1930s was being developed as a potential recreational area, an area where in the summer there was horse riding and dude ranches, and in the winter there was skiing in the Colorado Rockies. Kaeser, having grown up in Wisconsin in a Swiss family, had grown up on skis, and both the Kaesers loved skiing. At that time, Fritz Kaeser first met André Roch. Roch was an award-winning Swiss skier and mountaineer, an Olympian who had already published books on his expeditions in the Himalayas and in the Alps. These are two early photographs made during the late 1930s by Fritz Kaeser of skiers on the slopes at Aspen and of mountaineers climbing in the Rockies. He was a party to the development of Aspen, led by the Chicago industrialist Walter Pepke, and was in Aspen when Andre Roque planned the ski trails on Mount Hayden. In 1943, during World War II, Kaeser was drafted into the military, and he became part of the 10th Mountain Division of the U.S. Army at Camp Hale because of his skills as a skier and a photographer, and worked with the 10th Mountain Division in training in Colorado and as a photographer in Italy during the war. He was discharged after the war, and in 1945 he returned to the United States, where Kaeser briefly studied with Ansel Adams in San Francisco. Here I'm comparing a photograph by Kaeser of this period on the left with one by Ansel Adams, which is in our exhibition that you see on the right. The sense of composition and scale that Kaeser learned from Ansel Adams were important lessons, but he chose not to adopt Adams' use of the zone system and technical tricks in the darkroom that created such enormous tonal shifts. So in these similar compositions, one can see a very different personal style. After a year's travels in South America, the Kaesers returned to Aspen, where they settled, and Fritz Kaeser opened a camera shop and a professional photography studio. He made a specialty of going into the mountains and the wilderness and made photographs for commercial applications and also to be sold as home decoration. Here you see Kaeser on a hot day at high altitudes in the mountains, having set up his camera for a landscape view. His experiences as a skier and as a photographer made it possible for him to develop new techniques for capturing the unusual, bright environment of the high slopes. He refined a set of equipment that he could easily carry on cross-country and downhill skis that could capture the kind of imagery that was unique in its day, as reflected in this photograph from the late 1940s that shows the tracks of a skier across a slope. This is the photograph in our exhibition by Fritz Kaeser representing Andre Roque skiing down a slope in Aspen. It's a remarkable technical achievement for its time. The artist has created a dynamic composition by placing the slope on a diagonal while keeping the figure plumb in the middle of the image, and a sense of distance is given by the tops of the pines on the left. Kaeser is remarkable in his ability at this point to capture the fleecy clouds, the billows of snowflakes thrown up from the skis, and the twinkle of the ice crystals in the snowbank of the foreground. This is truly a photograph which was technically before its time. And in 1948, it was the image that won the Graflex International Photography Contest. Kaeser became famous for venturing into the wilderness around Aspen and through the Colorado Rockies to places that were only accessible by skis and taking photographs of the magnificent wilderness. One of his favorite subjects were the mountain peaks called Maroon Bells, and he photographed this landscape in all seasons. Here's an image in the winter when the lake before the Maroon Bells is iced over. And here is a photograph of the lake in the summertime with the mountains reflected in its surface and the large stones underneath the water easily visible. In Aspen, Kaeser encountered a photographer that we've spoken of before. This is Herbert Bayer, the Bauhaus designer and photographer from Germany who had come to work in Chicago with Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. And there he met Walter Pepke, the industrialist who developed the Container Corporation of America, a company that manufactured printed cardboard boxes during the 1930s, 40s, and into the future. This made Pepke a very rich man and able to finance the development of the new Bauhaus as an art school in Chicago. Walter Paepcke also created the Aspen Institute, a place for study and research into science and the arts in Aspen, Colorado. In 1951, he sponsored a photographic conference at the Aspen Institute, and at that time, the photographic magazine Aperture was founded. Fritz Kaeser was invited to attend this conference along with the most important photographers in the United States at that time. Here's a portrait of the attendees to the conference, and I'll point out several of them. On the far left, Millie Tangen is seated next to the column, with Ansel Adams in a hat next to her, looking through his light meter at her legs. Behind Adams is Herbert Bayer. Walter Paepcke is in the center of the photograph, kneeling, and on the far right, seated before the column, are Beaumont and Nancy Newhall. Beaumont Newhall was at that time the director of George Eastman House in Rochester, and both he and his wife Nancy had served as curators of photography at the Museum of Modern Art in New York before and during World War II. Behind Nancy Newhall, leaning on the column in a trilby hat with a mustache, is Fritz Kaeser. And he's glancing down at someone on Nancy Newhall's right, leaning forward, that we'll speak about in a minute, who is the photographer Frederick Summer. This event drew Kaeser into the upper echelons of American photography and made him feel as if he was accepted by these great creative photographers. At that time, the Kaesers moved to Tucson, Arizona, in order to have a house in the desert and another in the mountains. Here I'm showing you two of Kaeser's photographs from Tucson in the early 1950s. On the left, San Xavier de Bac, and on the right, an image from the Saguaro Desert. While living in Tucson, Kaeser became very friendly with the photographer Frederick Summer. Summer was then living in Prescott, Arizona, where he was working and teaching at Prescott College. Here I'm showing you a portrait of Summer and Summer's surrealist photograph called Paracelsus, which is included in our exhibition. This remarkable image was created with a handmade negative so that the artist drew on a piece of cellophane, then took this little sketch into the darkroom and enlarged it into a photographic print. This kind of surrealist experimentation was suggested to Summer by his friend Max Ernst. The German surrealist Max Ernst also lived in Arizona at this time, and the two artists were fast friends. I'm showing you on the left Frederick Summer's portrait of Max Ernst, and on the right a tiny little drawing by Ernst that's as big as a quarter, which give you a sense of this artist's interest in the materials with which he works and the fanciful surrealist imagery that fascinated him. Fritz Kaeser was deeply influenced by Frederick Summer. Here I'm comparing two photographs by these two photographers. On the left, a summer landscape of the Sonora Desert, and on the right, a photograph by Fritz Kaeser. You can see how Summer creates an all-over image that seems to flatten like a Jackson Pollock composition, while on the right, Kaeser uses a similar subject but retains the horizon, giving you a sense of depth, so that this relationship of taking what interested him was similar to the influence of Ansel Adams upon Fritz Kaeser. Or here in two still life images, Summer's on the left and Kaeser's on the right. Both artists were fascinated with the idea of wandering through the desert, looking at the ground, and photographing what they saw as if these abstract compositions created by nature were parallel to the fantasies of the human mind. Kaeser did the same sort of thing with plant forms in the desert, as he did with pieces of rock and molten metal that he found strewn around the desert floor, while Frederick Summer looked for bits of refuse, which he photographed in a way that would have suited Max Ernst. This is detail of a close landscape study of the desert in spring. Fritz Kaeser and his wife Millie converted to Roman Catholicism in the late 1950s, and 20 years later became associated with the Snite Museum of Art, where they both became members of the advisory council. The Kaesers supported the construction of a wing in the Snite Museum to house a studio for the sculptor Ivan Mestrovich. And after Fritz Kaeser's death, his wife Millie presented his collection of photographs to the Snite Museum, and many of those are included in our exhibition. Later, she made a major donation to the museum, which has become the financial foundation of our photography department. Much of the biographical information I've shared with you today on the lives of Fritz and Millie Kaeser come from the book by my colleague and predecessor, Stephen Moriarty. I'm David Acton. Thanks for listening, and please join us again for another look at photographs from our exhibition, Touchstones of the 20th Century.